How many people signed up to come to this as a result of the march? How many heard about it? Yeah?
Before.
And how many of you signed the People's Vote petition? So tonight, anybody who hasn't, please sign up. We've got some computers around so you can do it online, or we've got paper versions as well. So don't leave before you've signed up. My name is Peter Corkill. I'm Chair of Warwick District for Europe, and I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. This is our second speaker meeting that we've organised, and we work very closely with Stratford District for Europe, so I'd like to thank them and all their team who helped us here as well tonight. We've got more events planned, so the European Movement's got a National Day of Action on the 21st of July, and we'll be doing something then. And there are a couple of marches as well, if you enjoyed the march in London. There's a couple more coming up, one at the Conservative Party conference and another one in London. We've got a leaflet here saying, will you support us? So please, if you're able to support us, it might just be that occasionally you can deliver leaflets in your street. It might be you're a web design whiz. It could be anything. It doesn't have to be a big commitment, but many hands make light work, and we can really appreciate it. So we use more hands to organise more events. I'm delighted that we've got AC Grayling, Professor AC Grayling here tonight. So Professor Grayling is a robust supporter of the UK's continued membership of the European Union. Since the referendum, he has written many powerful articles as well as numerous media appearances, and he's spoken throughout the UK. He's a well-respected academic and philosopher. He's master of the New College of the Humanities, which he founded, and is a fellow of St Anne's College, Oxford. He has published numerous books and articles on, amongst other things, metaphysics and morality. But he's not just concerned with abstract ideas, but how they apply to everyday life too. The European Union came about in response to the horrors of the two world wars. AC has considered these directly in his writings and his book. Among the Dead Cities, was the Allied bombing of civilians in World War II a necessity or a crime? And I think we shouldn't forget that the European Union came about to stop war, and that's a very powerful motivation as well. In his book, he said, history has got to be got right before it distorts into legend and diminishes into oversimplification. I think we've agreed this is an accurate description of what's happening in the debate over the UK's membership with the EU. Much of the Brexit arguments depend on mythical beliefs of history that never existed and the simplification of what will happen after we've left. AC Grayling will try and help us tonight avoid that ever happening with his talk, Fighting Brexit, The Next Steps. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Well, it was a wonderful day on Saturday, absolutely wonderful day. I was also at the head of the march, and when much later on I walked back up Whitehall from a very, very crowded Parliament Square, people were still flooding down, still streaming down Whitehall. This was ages afterwards. It was absolutely huge. It's very difficult to estimate numbers, and you've probably seen a variety of numbers. You've seen them anywhere between 100,000 and 500,000, claimed by some who claim to be quoting the Metropolitan Police, who I suppose are in a reasonably good position to know. Actually, the Metropolitan Police have quite good estimates of the numbers of people who congregate in Pall Mall and in Whitehall and in Parliament Square, and it could be that the number of people present on Saturday was somewhere in the region of 200, between 200 and 300,000. It's possible that they were. But even if it was, let me just say in inverted commas, only 100,000 people, that is fantastic, because each one person is the tip of an iceberg of people, except a very hot iceberg of people because they're all jolly cross about what's happening at the moment. And therefore, being on the march was a wonderful thing to do, representing an increasing sentiment in the country that this is wrong for our country and that it must be stopped. Now, I'm confident, and I have been from about 2 hours after the referendum result was declared, that Brexit is going to stop. It's going to be stopped. Or at very, 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 very least, as a plan B, and I think an increasingly unlikely plan B, that if some form of incredibly soft, squidgy, spongy form of semi-Brexit were alleged to have happened at some point in the next year or two, that it won't last very long. But far better if it is stopped altogether. And I think that the accumulating weight of pressures on the Brexit process have now got to a point where in the 4 or 5 months, October to February, coming up, we're going to see this whole house of cards collapsing. There are people who are shaking their head with disbelief at that in this audience. I want to tell you why. I want to tell you what these accumulations of pressures are. And I'd like to remind you, since some of us here at any rate are now forgotten what our 21st birthday parties were like, but we will perhaps remember Space Invaders. Do you remember that game, Space Invaders, where you start off with a couple of enemies and you have to blast them, and then more turn up, more turn up, more turn up, till eventually you're overwhelmed? Well, that's exactly the situation that's happening with the Brexit process, that the number of pressures, the number of invaders, so to speak, increasing all the time. So let me go through them, and you will see as I proceed through all these different factors how their joint weight is exerting the pressure that I am referring to. So let me begin first with some of the most recent news that big business, is now coming out at last into the public and expressing their anxieties. Now, we've known that business, large, medium and small business, have been expressing their anxieties about Brexit from the very off, but they've been doing it privately. Just before the referendum, over 85% of British businesses said they wanted to stay in the EU. And there was what seemed like a stunned silence after 23rd of June 2016. And we heard nothing at all from the business community, or even indeed from the City of London, which has a great vulnerability to not having passporting rights for financial services and so on. And we might have thought that this was very surprising. What was going on? What was the CBI doing? What were all the trades organisations doing in not saying anything? Well, they were saying things. They were doing it privately. They were talking to MPs. They were trying to talk to the government. But their frustration with government has been increasing and has now long past breaking point. About 3 months ago, I attended a dinner in the City of London, which was putatively a dinner meant to bring together some senior politicians on the one side and senior representatives of big and well-known business on the other side, to try to resolve the question of why it is the government is simply not listening to business. They're just simply not dealing with them. They were just blanking them and saying, it's all over, we've had the vote and we're going to do this thing, and so you must just grin and bear it. And in fact, we've seen a very trenchant, pungent summary of the government attitude towards businesses' take on Brexit, published just recently. I won't mention it in mixed company. But Boris Johnson, as usual, providing us with an insight into it. Right. So why was it that business was not talking publicly about it? Because had they been doing so, it would have given a much greater impetus to the anti-Brexit movement in the country at an earlier point. Well, the answer is this. Supposing that you're a business, and there will be business people in this group, you're worried about saying to your customers, your clients, your suppliers, and your workforce that you think that if any form of Brexit were to happen, it's going to be extremely bad for your business. What's going to happen? Well, your customers might say, well, I better look elsewhere then. Your clients, your suppliers might say, well, these people are going to tank pretty soon, so I need to find somebody else to sell to, somewhere where I know they're going to be in a position to buy the products that I produce. some of your best work people might think, crumbs, well, I better look for a different job if this one isn't going to last very long. So you put at risk your business if you flag up serious concerns about it early on. You have a duty as a board, you have a duty to your shareholders to do your best for the company, and you might think for a while anyway, while the jury is out, while we don't know what kind of arrangements might follow a putative Brexit, just keeping on, and don't say anything, don't frighten the horses, try and keep a steady hand on the tiller. But then there is the other pressure, which is that you have a separate duty to your shareholders, which is to warn them of a danger. And at some point, the balance between the two, trying to keep things steady and keep things quiet, and informing your shareholders and even indeed your customers, clients, your workforce, that there is a real problem looming, that becomes overwhelming. And we've now seen business of all sizes beginning to come out and saying, this is getting pretty desperate. What the heck is happening here? Multinational companies are not too worried because they've got footholds in lots of different other countries. And so if things go belly up here, they can simply move their operations or rely on where else they are. But it is medium-sized and small British companies located here, providing work here, providing tax revenues through their employees' wages and through company taxes, who are the lifeblood of our economy. And they are now very, very, very seriously worried. There are literally tens of thousands of small to medium-sized businesses so dependent upon very, very complex supply chains, in some cases sensitive within a matter of hours of supply. I mean, just look at the car assembly business in this country. As you know, we don't invent and make cars, we assemble them now, but that means that literally thousands of parts from big to small are brought into the country from all over Europe and even outside Europe and are assembled together into cars that go back into Europe here. And these supply chains are sensitive to a matter of hours. So on the production line, they're expecting parts to come in an hour or two before they're needed on that production line. And this is what's happening across many, many borders in Europe. So there is real anxiety, and business is now stepping up its complaints and coming out into the open and saying this is a disaster. We've seen British Aerospace, we've seen Pfizer, we've seen Honda, we've seen Nissan, we've seen major banks in the city and other financial services, and indeed some of them have already begun to move or to open offices outside the UK. Frankfurt, Paris and Dublin are creaming in the treasures of this country, the wealth of this country, which is being dispersed to pay for a complete unicorn-shaped ideology, which is the Brexit ideology. And this is disastrous. Think of it. If hundreds of thousands of jobs are at risk, every single job, or almost every single job, represents a family. It represents an unemployed person. It represents a burden on the welfare system. It represents a drop in tax revenues for the country. It represents less resource for the National Health Service, for state education, for looking after our environment, for protecting consumers' interests, for providing opportunities for employees to have things like maternity leave. It's a devastation of our, not just our economy, but of our social fabric, if our economy takes a big hit from Brexit. That fact alone, that one fact alone about the effect on the economy, by itself would have made any rational group of people sit up and say, well, hang on a second. So that would have been a rational group of people. Now let's have a look at what's happening in politics. And here, you see signs which would have been unimaginable 2 years or perhaps even 18 months ago, even after the referendum. But we now see them. In the debates about the so-called meaningful vote, and by the way, the meaningful vote amendment of Dominic Grieve and the House of Lords and so on was in any case an irrelevance. It's an irrelevance. And there's a technical reason why that is so. And that is that, technically speaking, the constitution of this country, now as you know, we have an uncodified constitution. It consists in part of statute, but also in large part of tradition and custom. And it's been very well described as a set of understandings that nobody understands, which, of course, is of the greatest use to politicians, because it means they can do what they like. And this is a point that I'm going to come back to, because the last 5 referendums in this country will all run on a completely different basis from one another. And when that happens, you see that there is something wrong with the way our politics and our constitution is being handled. So I'll come back to that point later, because it's a very important one. So, technically speaking, Parliament is sovereign. A one-vote majority in Parliament can do anything it likes in this country because there is no constraint on it. And that means that you don't have to put into statute a requirement that a process should be brought back to the House of Commons and so on. The House of Commons could meet tomorrow morning and vote and have a one-vote majority, which just stops Brexit right there. They could do it right now. So that was a kind of distraction. It was a bit of theatre. It was an attempt by the Remainers, who are, by the way, in the majority in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords, and that's another very important point for the crunch situation which we're seeing this coming autumn. Because, as you know, the idea of a no-deal crash-out Brexit is completely and utterly off the table. There's such a big majority in the House of Commons against that happening already that that's not going to happen. So the situation in Parliament looks like a very interesting one in the autumn, but all the more so for the reason that I want to describe. I want you to recall that in the vote on the meaningful amendment, 90 Labour MPs voted against the party whip, and 20 Conservative MPs were prepared to do so. Now, rebellions in the Conservative Party are usually very feeble affairs, and they usually do fizzle out sometime before their actual crunch moment. It's been well said of the Conservative Party, which of course puts party unity and the position of the party far ahead of any other consideration, like, for example, the interests of the country or the economy and so on. But it's been well said about the Conservative Party that the Europhiles always compromise, and the Eurosceptics never do, which is why they win. But that is changing. There is now deep anger on both sides of the Conservative Party. Now, I don't know whether any of you here ever get a rush of blood to the head and look at the Daily Mail newspaper, do you? I hope not. But had you done so last week, you would have seen that the Daily Mail had exposed a great conspiracy in London. Did you see that? It had photographs of the conspirators coming out of Europe House in Smith Square in Southwest London. Did you see that, anybody? Well, I have the great privilege and interest of chairing the coordinating group of all the national Remainer organisations, Open Britain, the European Movement, Best for Britain, and so on. We meet regularly every 3 weeks to discuss what each one is doing. Some of us work with Parliament, with the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Europe. Some work with local organisations. Some are just straightforward campaigning groups. So we meet on a regular basis, and we invite people to come and talk to us. And on that occasion, we had invited Dominic Grieve to come and talk to us, and it was right in the middle of the meaningful vote amendment discussions. And somebody had leaked this to the press, and the Daily Mail had a photographer outside, and he took photographs of us all leaving. And then in the Daily Mail, it said, "These are the conspirators." This is some conspiracy, isn't it? I mean, we're out in the open. 100,000 of us minimum last Saturday were conspiring in the streets of London, weren't we? So we were the conspirators coming out of Europe House, and of course it misreported it and claimed that this was the European Commission was trying to subvert British democracy and so on. So the usual rubbish. But at that meeting, Dominic Grieve revealed to us that the split in the Conservative Party, and as you know, the Conservative Party is at least two parties, two very, very different parties, and the one that is making the running at the moment is the Eurosceptic, the so-called ERG, or European Research Group in the Conservative Party. These are the Brexiters. These are the only people in the country who have a clear idea of what they want, why they want Brexit. These are the people who made a bucket of money on the night of the referendum by shorting the pound. You may remember. That's come out in the open now. But they know exactly what they want, and they've been out in the public domain about it. Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg, if you've ever heard of him, I call him and the other ERG people the Moggies. Jacob Rees-Mogg has been out in the public domain saying what they want is a low-tax offshore economy where, because that's the only way you're going to get any kind of inward investment. Don't forget, inward investment in the UK has dropped by 90%, 90% since the referendum, which is a disaster for any economy. But in order to attract inward investment, you have to have extremely low taxes in a very, very hospitable environment for people to bring their money in from Russia or wherever it might be. And that's what they want. And of course, in that kind of environment, you just don't have the money for the kind of thing that we value, our NHS, our education system, and the rest. And they don't care about it. Because you don't think that Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg sends his children to state schools or uses the NHS or bothers about the quality of our rivers and beaches and air in the cities. No. So they have a very clear idea of what they want and why they're doing this. But in the Conservative Party, that split between the two sides of the Conservative Party has now become unhealable, irreconcilable. They've managed to hang together. We've seen over the decades the difficulty that leaders of the Conservative Party have had in trying to keep it together. You may remember Mr. John Major's, or Sir John Major's, unparliamentary language that he used to describe the Eurosceptics back in the early 1990s. Well, imagine what, if Theresa May knew any unparliamentary language, what she would be saying about the situation that she's facing now in the Conservative Party. The split is fatal. If we were able to fast forward, if we could just nip into H.G. Wells' time machine and just go forward a few years and have a look at where the political parties are, would we see the Conservative Party still surviving? Well, there might be a Conservative Party, but I doubt very much whether it is this one. The same thing is true of Labour. 90 Labour MPs defied the whip, the great majority of them in favour of the so-called meaningful vote. Now, the Labour Party, Parliamentary Labour Party, the party in the country, that is party members in the country, Labour voters or supporters in the country who are not members of the party, and the Corbyn office are a bit like the solar system, different planets. The Parliamentary Labour Party and the Corbyn office are really on different planets, and they loathe one another, and they don't get on with one another at all. And in a desperate effort to try to retain party unity, the Parliamentary Labour Party has, until pretty recently anyway, tried to toe the line. They're extremely unhappy with the pro-Brexit line that Corbyn and MacDonald and Seamus Milne have taken. By the way, I don't know whether you know this, but Seamus Milne, who used to be on the Guardian newspaper, now a Wickhamist, educated at Winchester College and Balliol College, Oxford, son of the former Director General of the BBC, has come out as a man of the people. He's a real working class hero now, thinking that Brexit will be a great opportunity to introduce a Bennite version of socialism. Remember Tony Benn? When he campaigned against going into the EEC back in the 1970s, it was on the grounds that we should build very high protectionist walls and renationalise the commanding heights of the economy. And then once we got everything going hunky-dory, we will bring down the protectionist walls and we will be a world beater in world trade. Well, Jeremy Corbyn learned that at Tony Benn's knee and has learned nothing since. So he's on that side of the argument, and the rest of the Parliamentary Labour Party is not. And indeed, I heard, and this could be a rumour, it could not be true, but I heard from a very, very senior BBC news editor that in the election last year, the general election, at which Mrs. May asked for a mandate for Brexit and lost her majority, but the meaning of that event seems to have bypassed her completely. But at that general election, Jeremy Corbyn and his office were hoping that the Labour Party would lose badly. They were hoping to lose a lot of MPs, especially moderate Blairite MPs, so they could parachute in the true believers at the next election after Conservatives have made a mess of Brexit and the country, and Jeremy Corbyn and his little cabal could come in on their white chargers and save us all. So that was their hope at the time. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me. However, that's over now. I don't know whether you saw, but towards the end of last week, a vicious spat broke out between Chukaramuna and another member of the Labour Party who were calling one another names and so on. This kind of thing doesn't get into the open unless the splits in the party have become pretty irreconcilable. And Chukaramuna himself has been talking about the need for a new party or for a different party or a breakaway party. So these signs, these are, you have to be a bit of a Vatican watcher or a criminologist, you know, to see the signs. But what you are seeing is the two main political parties in this country beginning to fall apart under the pressures of Brexit. Because now that you know, things are starting to come to a head, and they come to a head between October and February in this coming period. As they come to a head, so the pressures become so excessive that people can no longer keep their mouths shut or keep pretending or work for party unity when they recognise what a wrecking effect it is having on our country. So you've seen it begin. And over the summer, what will be happening? What are MPs doing? They're whispering, they're meeting, they're emailing, texting one another. They are behind closed doors. They're thinking what the hell's going to happen in the autumn. In the autumn, there are some very, very big votes coming up in Parliament. The moment to make a decision about whether there will be another referendum, whether we will have to make a choice about customs union, single market, which, again, I'll come back to this point in a moment, but which is, of course, an admission of the fact that we shouldn't be leaving the EU at all. When all these decisions have to be made in the autumn, these splits, these noises that you're hearing from the great ice flows of the political parties cracking up and beginning to separate, and the icebergs falling off this is going to get out of hand, this metaphor, but you can see what I mean, that the political process is now coming to a point of crisis. And that is a good thing too, because in the crisis of the political parties there are opportunities, and eventually I think we are going to see that Remainer majority in both houses of Parliament at last asserting itself. Mm-hmm. Of course, you might think to yourself now, why the hell haven't they done it already? How has it taken so long? It feels as if the referendum were about 3,000 years ago and we've been living with this nightmare for ages. But I say that if you were to pop forward 5 or 10 or 15 years' time, or imagine what future historians will write about this period, what's happened in the 2 years since the 2016 referendum has actually happened quite fast. The fact that the march on Saturday was the biggest march of all of them, that every march has got bigger than the last march, that more people now belong to local groups like yours, that the impossibilities, the facts, the realities have begun to accumulate at such a rate has actually happened, in historical terms anyway, very quickly. And when you look back at what the Dutch did and what the Swedes did and what the Irish did when they had referendums on various aspects of EU treaties and developments, and they voted no in the first instance and then yes in the second instance, there you see a pattern. You see a pattern of EU countries involved in this immense project, this great imaginative, idealistic project which is the EU. A lot of difficulties, a lot of flaws, a lot of problems, of course, but the point of it and the aim of it is such that it takes quite a lot of work. It's a great boulder to be rolling up the hill, and of course there are going to be anxieties and worries. Monsieur Macron was asked a few months ago whether, if he had a referendum in France today on EU membership, what the result would be. He said, well, there would be a majority to leave. So, our responsibility as politicians is to give a lead, is to hold our nerve, is to try to persuade people of the value of what we're doing and to keep on with that project, but not to give in to, well, those who want to try to take an opportunity to wreck the process. And in fact, here is a very, very crucial point. This was the last opportunity that the Eurosceptics had to try to get the UK out of the EU. The last opportunity. Why? Because the readers of the Eurosceptic press, the Telegraph, the Mail, the Express, they are all, like some of us here, forgetting their 21st birthdays. And indeed, some of them have absolutely gone beyond the bar of time altogether. The young, those, and by the way, marvellous for anybody here who is 45 years of age or younger. That's what the young are today. That's brilliant. But the young are overwhelmingly in favour of EU membership. Put those two facts together. The older generation, the readers of the Eurosceptic press, the people who've given their support to the Eurosceptics, a very small group of them, they are fading away, and the upcoming generations are Europeans. They are very much in favour of the EU. This is why we would, if any form of Brexit were to happen, we would be back in the EU fairly soon in the course of the next few years, especially if we keep on campaigning to get back in. So we have our plan B. But the future is European. And this was their last opportunity to do it, because if the 2016 referendum had been held in 2020 or 2025, there wouldn't have been any question whatever about the outcome. So this was their last opportunity. So there is something to watch, which is the falling apart of the political process. There are other things happening. On the 7th of July, next week, in the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, a case is being heard by 5 justices of the ECJ. This is a case being brought by fellow citizens of ours, British citizens, who have been living abroad for more than 15 years. In the name of one of them, a Second World War veteran by the name of Schindler, without a C. He's not Schindler's List, he's Schindler. So the case is known as the Schindler case. And they are claiming before the European Court of Justice that their human rights were violated because they were prevented from having a say in this very, very important referendum which had a material impact on their well-being and their welfare. That case, if it is decided in favour of Schindler and the others, there are a number of them who are party to this case, if it's found in favour of them, it really does throw the spanner in the works of the Brexit process. It could technically stop it dead, but it probably won't. What will probably happen then is that the fact that the human rights of our fellow citizens have been violated in that very important way, adds to something else which is now coming out at such a rate of knots and so overwhelming in its impact, evidential impact, which is the fraudulent nature and the flaws of the referendum in 2016 itself. We've begun to see there's already one criminal charge has been laid, and we've seen the Electoral Commission this week coming out and saying that what happened was so flawed that a serious revision of our electoral practices is now needed. They're just published now. What day is it today? So Tuesday, isn't it? My thinking. If it's Warwick, it must be Tuesday. They just came out yesterday with this announcement, the Electoral Commission. Their anxieties about the referendum are such that serious reform is required of the process. Now, let us just remind ourselves of why, whatever happens, we stop Brexit for the next few months, or some form of something or other happens which is temporarily a semi-kind of Brexit. But whatever happens, we have to address the question of our political arrangements and our constitutional arrangements. It's so important to bear in mind the illegitimacy of the outcome of the referendum. Don't forget this. The franchise for the referendum was given to a normal standard general election franchise. That meant that our fellow EU citizens from other parts of the EU, using their freedom of movement right, not immigration, but freedom of movement right, to come and live here, work here, pay their taxes here, contribute to our society, marry among us, bring up their children among us, were denied a voice in something which had a huge impact and has been having a huge impact on them ever since. They were denied a voice. In the Scottish independence referendum of 2014, 16 and 17-year-olds were given a vote because their futures were at stake. Exactly the same thing applied to people in this country. 16 and 17-year-olds ought to have been given a voice. They weren't. And our own citizens living abroad were denied a voice as well. That's the substance of the Schindler case. So 3 very important constituencies of people were left out. Why? Not by mistake, but because the Brexiters said to Cameron at the time, they said, these people will all vote Remain, you've got to keep them out, because you're stacking the odds against us. And Cameron, for whatever reason, now, you know, everybody thought that he was just lazy and inattentive and careless and thought he was lucky and he always won referendums, so it didn't matter. Now people are saying, well, did he know how much money could be made if you were a hedge fund? I don't know. The conspiracy theorists are hard at work already. I think it was just laziness and inattentiveness. But at any rate, he didn't want to argue. He said this in public. He didn't want to argue with the Eurosceptics about the franchise, and so those groups were left out. Therefore, the electorate was a restricted one. Now I ask you, what percentage of that electorate voted to leave? Answer, you all know the answer, 37%. 37% of the electorate voted to leave. Now you should, the sound of jaws hitting chests really should be deafening us when you contemplate that fact. You need to have 40% minimum vote of every member of a trades union to have a strike. That's a minimum threshold. In some of the referendums we've had in recent years in the United Kingdom, minimum thresholds have been demanded. The famous Scottish devolution referendum of 1979 had a minimum 40% threshold. It had something like a 54%, 55% of the popular vote in favour, but that didn't reach 40% of the electorate, and so it didn't happen. In Parliament itself, where, by the way, all sorts of different voting systems like transferable vote and alternative vote and membership lists are used for things like chairmen of select committees and deputy speakers and the like. But we stick with the first past the post voting system for our Parliament, not for the European Parliament, not for the devolved authorities, but for our own Parliament we have it still, with the result that we have minority governments, like the one which is in power at the moment, doing what they like, because if you're the executive you control the legislature in this country, which again is a constitutional problem. But the referendum of 2016 delivered a 37% vote in favour of leave. Now, again, a rational, grown-up group of people might have assembled together in Parliament and have said, right, we remember that both in Parliament itself and in the papers issued to MPs, because you will remember, you can look it up on the internet, you can go on the internet, House of Commons Library, briefing paper 07212, paragraph 5, informed the MPs about to debate the referendum bill in 2015 that the referendum was advisory only, consultative only. Paragraph 6 of that paper, by the way, says if you were to think otherwise, if you were at all tempted to think this might be mandating, you've got to remember that for constitutional change you need a threshold or a supermajority. This was made perfectly clear to MPs. You know that MPs get these briefing papers. They tend to be quite short sentences and simple words so that the MPs can understand what they're about to debate in Parliament. But in Parliament itself on this, and that paper was published on the 3rd of June 2015, on the 16th of June 2015, Mr. Leamington, who was the Minister for Europe at the time, said in terms on the floor of the House of Commons, this referendum is advisory only. Therefore, you would expect a rational group of people to have assembled after the referendum and said, let's have a look at it. We see that 37% of this restricted electorate that we impaneled for this have said to leave. So let us consider, let's have a look at the plan, the roadmap, the impact studies, the effect on the economy. There weren't any. Oh, good. Okay, well, so we have nothing was proposed for what should happen afterwards. It was advisory only, and it was just over a third of the people who wanted it. So should we go ahead with it or not? That's what should have happened. They should have considered that, but instead they didn't. And do you know what? I actually put the blame in some way on the press, and not least on Mr. David Blooming Dimbleby, whom I used to like. But when on that night in the early hours of the morning, the 24th of June, he said, the people have spoken, full stop. We are out of Europe, full stop. And that just sent the politicians flying like a bunch of blooming rabbits in front of the foxes, and that was it. There was no discussion. And do you know what? There never has been a discussion to this day in Parliament about the referendum outcome other than to appeal to this absolutely absurd mantra, the people have spoken, the will of the people. That 37% of the electorate represents 26% of the people. So now, We have to remember that has got to be put right. That should never happen again. Never happen again. We've got to get our constitutional order in such a shape that that just can't be allowed to happen. One of the things which is needed for that, of course, is exactly the reform to our electoral system that the Electoral Commission itself has been talking about. First past the post voting produces minority-based governments with big majorities in Parliament, and the result is that we get highly partisan politics, and we've witnessed in this last 2 years a cabal, a small group of right-wing Conservative MPs, aided by a small group of far-left Labour MPs, together carrying the whole country into a completely different course of history, or trying to, at any rate. And there doesn't seem to be a way automatically to draw them back, that we've had to fight in order to prevent this from happening. This is something which would not happen if we had some form of proportional representation, which would almost certainly produce coalition governments. Now, a lot of people, we've been told by our press and by our politicians that coalition government is bad and that we should have strong government and so on. Well, personally, I'm fed up with strong government, or even weak government for that matter, the kind that we have now. And you look around the world, just do the empirical work. Look around the world, look at countries where they have proportional representation in coalition governments, and you will see that the great majority of them, not, for example, Israel or Italy, where their systems allow very, very small parties to have an overwhelming influence in their legislature, but in countries like Germany and other European countries, you see higher standards of living, much greater stability, a more consensual political order, and kinds of policies on things that matter to the society, like education, like the environment, like provision of health services, which are consensual as a result of there being coalitions. So I'm all in favour of it. And if you wanted one knockdown argument on this, think of this. In a first-past-the-post system, if you had a constituency of 100 people and you had 10 candidates standing and 8 of them got 10 votes each and 1 got 9 votes and the last of them got 11 votes, it would be the person supported by 11 out of the 100 people who went to Parliament. That's what happens in our system all the time, and it ain't right. So that's another thing which has got to change. So the constitutional problem is exacerbated by the fact that we now learn that there may well have been foreign interference. You may have been influenced, unconsciously or otherwise, by what you thought Neil from Neasden was saying about Brexit, and it turns out that it was actually Vladimir from Vladivostok who was saying it, and not Neil from Neasden at all. If there was foreign interference, if money was pledged or paid or promised to people on the Leave side of the argument, to leave EU, Aaron Banks and others, if that was so, that is an extremely serious matter. Apart from anything else, it's a criminal offence. But we don't even need the foreign interference. We only have to look at the lies, the deceptions, the distortions that were used, and the avowals. Mr. Dominic Cumming, who led the official Leave campaign, said that they had won the referendum on the basis of lies. He said it in public. And we know also that false promises, like the 350 million on the side of a bus, were very influential in that too. So there are lots of reasons for thinking that the 2016 referendum is actually void. It is actually void. A number of different reasons for thinking that. And that argument about the illegitimacy of the referendum is an argument that is not going to go away. And it is one of the pressures on the Brexit process, and we may see something come of it in due course. Because people like Carol Cadwallader, other investigative journalists, and indeed investigations into alleged criminality and massive overspending on the Leave campaign may very well produce some results in public which will make it impossible to regard the referendum result as being allowed to stand. So that is another feature. So the action in court next week, the investigation into the referendum itself, these are other aspects set alongside the political parties beginning to implode, business coming out and saying that they just cannot stomach this. And then think about what we ourselves, as individuals, as pro-Europeans, as Remainers, are doing. We are continuing to protest. Local groups are continuing to grow. This dynamic for a people's vote, which was introduced very recently, just in the last few weeks, this whole project was launched for a people's vote. It has taken off big time. The dynamic behind it now is such that it is beginning to look overwhelming. How can our political and governmental order ignore the fact that there is this great upswelling of demand, that now that we have some facts, now that we know some of the impacts, now that we see some of the anxieties, that people who know what they're talking about, unlike the politicians, like people in business, people in the health service, when we see all this gathering strength, we see that the impetus towards another referendum, which is what the people's vote is, you may know or already that the choice of term, people's vote, rather than second referendum or think again or another chance and so on, is in order to ensure that we can harvest the assent to a people's voice from the wider community of people who are not, perhaps like ourselves, gung-ho Remainers. And here is an interesting point. I mentioned to you earlier that I have the privilege of chairing this group of Remainer organisations. We do polling and we do focus groups. And we have seen increasingly over time, and certainly during the course of this calendar year, the movement in public opinion against Brexit and for another say is now overwhelming. The margin between those who want a people's vote and those who don't is now 23%. That's how big the margin is. The majority of people in our country now think that Brexit is a bad mistake. Again, you look at YouGov polling, they've asked exactly the same question from the same constituency of people ever since the referendum. You look at them, you look at the graph, you see there is now a majority of people saying this is a mistake. So the wind is set in our direction very strongly. And this is one reason why the increase in volume of the anti-Brexit voice is so marked. So this is extremely good news. Now, when you look at the demographics, you see that there are about, somewhere in the region of about 23 or 24% of the voting population in this country are hard Brexit. They want it at any cost. They don't even know. In fact, I saw a tweet just yesterday, in fact, which said, oh, Airbus, you know, so how are the European aeroplanes going to fly without wings? Tell me that. Well, you can have some sense of exactly the level, you know, of some of the insight into what might happen if a Brexit were to happen. That it's going to be almost impossible to win those people over. So there are about 24% of people who are hard for Brexit. About 50% of the population splits between soft Remain and soft Leave. And these are the important groups, because another 25% of people, and most of us here belong to that 25%, I suppose, are gung-ho Remainers. Okay? We're not going to change our mind. Nobody's going to come up and say to us, sovereignty, and we think, oh yes, absolutely, or I'm suddenly become a Brexiter, right? So we're not going to have our minds changed. So it's that 50%, the soft Leavers and the soft Remainers, who need to be spoken to and targeted. The soft Remainers are those who say, oh, isn't it too late now? Isn't it all over? Oh dear, well, I voted Remain, but I suppose, you know, we're going to be up. You have to say to them, no, emphatically not. This is not over. You've got to stay, you know, keep to your principles here. Keep to your commitment, because we can win this one. We can stop it. We can stop it. And we can reverse it if necessary. So if you believe in Europe, if you believe in the UK being in Europe, you've got to stay strong as a Remainer. And you've got to join up with the rest of us, because the more of us there are, the more likely it is that we're going to win this argument. So that is an important task for each one of us to do, is to challenge people over their views and to invite them, encourage them, persuade them to stay firm. So that's the soft Remainers. The soft Leavers are the really interesting group. They're the ones whose opinions are changing. They're the ones now, you see them, I did vote Leave, and now I realise I made a mistake, I was misled or misinformed or had the wrong idea or didn't think this would result, this kind of Brexit would result. So people who can be addressed and encouraged and persuaded to join the Remain camp. That, I think, is part of what we as individuals can do in our individual and group campaigning, is to look out for the people on soft leave and soft remain and to get to work on them. Because every individual who answers a question in a poll, every individual who writes a letter to an MP, every individual who joins a march makes a difference. This business about, oh well, if I don't turn up or if I don't write a letter or I don't try and discuss this with somebody, it's not going to matter. Other people will do it. That's not good enough any longer. This is a moment of crisis in the history of our country, and every single one of us has got to step up and play a part, and that's how to do it. And one of the most effective things, by the way, you will hear from MPs or people who work for MPs, that if they get lots of letters on the same point from the same person, they say to their staff, just chuck them in the bin. Well, I say, make their bins overflow. Just keep on writing those letters and keep on pestering the hell out of them until they really get frightened about the effect that there are people out there so determined and so relentless that they're not going to give up on this one. But one of the really wonderful things you can do, because this really does, as Corporal Jones might say, they don't like this up, and this is when you turn up at their constituency surgeries. Now, of course, it depends who your MP is. Let us suppose it's either a Labour or Conservative MP, but you know them to be Remainers. Turn up and encourage them. Tell them how much you admire them. Say how important it is that they should put the country before party, and and pat them on the back and tell them how nice they are. Even bake them a cake if necessary. If you are lucky enough to have a Conservative MP who is a hard Brexiter, then what you do is you turn up at the surgery and you can say, "Ooh, I'm so worried about Scotland leaving the UK. What do you think about that, Mr. MP? Are you okay with the breakup of the United Kingdom?" What would he say? "Oh, no, we can't have that. We're not going to have the UK breaking up. Scotland must stay." You say, and Mr. MP, why is that?" "Well, because we're much stronger together, and Scotland is much better off in the UK. United we stand," and blah, bloody blah. You can just imagine how it's. You say, "Oh, well, why doesn't that apply to the UK being in the EU?" Just catch them out on their hypocrisy, because that's exactly what they do say. I've heard it with my own ears from MPs giving a powerful argument for unity and cooperation and pooling of resources and staying together and being stronger and blah, blah, blah. And that's about the UK, but not about the EU. Catch them out. Go with a carefully prepared question. Fool them into tripping themselves up. Do it. Because what you have to do is get them to think. It may not be something they're used to doing, but you could be doing them a great service if you can do that. Same applies. Doesn't matter whether it's a Labour MP or a Conservative MP, but if you go to constituency surgeries, you can make a difference. It has a very big impact when people actually turn up. Writing, going to constituency surgeries, working with your fellows in groups like this, encouraging people you meet, and witnessing. Now, some years ago, I happened to attend a meeting in Austin, Texas. Remember, that Austin in Texas is to Texas what California is to the US as a whole. That is, it is a place of liberal sentiment and open-mindedness. It's a place of wonderful jazz and blues music and the like. Oh, am I overrunning? Oh my God, it's this side. And it's absolutely super. In Austin, Texas, they had a huge conference for atheists, because the woman who founded the American Atheist Association happened to hail from Texas many years ago. So in her honor, in the 50th anniversary, they had it there. It was very interesting. And there was an extremely congenial debate between the American atheists and a bunch of local Baptist ministers. So it was very entertaining to watch. But the thing that I noticed was that the American atheists had decided to adopt a technique that gay people had used in America to very great effect. To say, I am such and such, so I'm gay or I am atheist, and I'm out and proud about it. And at the minute that they did that, they found all sorts of other people said, "Oh, how wonderful, me too, I'm the same, how marvelous to be able to meet somebody else who feels the same way." Now this technique is as old as the hills. It's even written in the scriptures themselves. Bear witness. That's exactly what they're doing. I'm out and proud. I'm a pro-European and I'm out and proud. I'm bearing witness to the fact that I think that our country is going to be better in Europe. Don't worry, I'm going to shut up in a minute. So this is something that we can do, is to bear witness, to be out and proud as Europeans, and to have faith that we are going to stop this. And at the very, 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 very minimum, we are going to win the argument about being part of the EU, and the future of our country and our fellow European countries together is, I think, secure in the medium and the long run. Thank you. I'm so sorry to go.
I'll cut your applause short because I think you'll be grateful, because we only have about 10 minutes for questions. So I want to get as many in as well as possible. So please. Yeah, this is yours. No speeches, just short questions, please. And we will grab the mic off you if it's going on too long. AC Grayling, that was absolutely fantastic. We'll only say we're very lucky to have a pro-European MP and a Brexiteer, so we can put both of your strategies into operation. And in fact, part of our district is the Attorney General's constituency. So we have an opportunity to get right into the heart of government if you live in Southend or Kenilworth, and really, make our views known at the heart of government. So we'll take a couple of questions at a time.
Yes, please. Yeah.
And so I'll take.
Oh no! Don't take a couple of questions at a time. Take one at a time. Otherwise, I'll forget the other ones.
Gentleman there.
Oh, the gentleman.
Thank you. I'm Robert Gowndry. We have an insightful analysis from you, Professor, about the state of the parties as they currently are. What I think was missing, perhaps, was some explanation of the practical implications. How, because we're not going to get constitutional reform before next March. So what is it actually likely to happen? And does it require a strong person to stand up in Parliament and develop something?
Yes, that's a very good point. Thank you. I should have emphasised, stressed more, the thought that the need for constitutional and political reform in our country is something that we've got to address once the dust has settled on Brexit. Obviously, we can't do it now, unfortunately. Your point about somebody standing up and taking a lead and making it possible for other people. Well, you were all reading Tolstoy in the bath last night, so you remember his completely mistaken view that individuals don't make a difference to history. He thought that the Battle of Borodino wasn't won or lost by Napoleon or Kutuzov, it was just an accident. Well, that's false. Look at Mandela or Tutu or Churchill, or look at charismatic leaders who would stand up and give permission to people to think a certain way. If there were a Mandela in Palestine or Israel today, what a difference it would make to the process there. So this is very significant. We're going to have to hope that there will be somebody, some man or woman in Parliament who will become salient in this respect and make it possible for other MPs to take a stand. I think this may have happened already. It may be that there are people like Anna Soubry and Chuka Umunna and Dominic Reeve and various others who are beginning to show a little bit. It's a bit like the Derby, isn't it, when you begin to see a few horses starting to pull ahead a little bit. So we may see something. None of them have quite the charisma of Nelson Mandela, but you never know. Perhaps there is a Nelson Mandela there. But certainly, we're not going to make constitutional reform between now and then, but I think that what we have seen already in the way of internal fractures in the two main political parties is a very healthy sign for what's going to happen in the autumn. Can you do that so I can hear you? Yeah. Yeah.
Just hold it close.
Just wanted to say, what do you think England's progress in the World Cup will do for Brexit and for that? Is there anything that we can actually use?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point that you raised because, of course, It's on record empirically that winning football matches, rugby matches and cricket matches raises the testosterone level among young men who watch these things on television, and that can be either for good or ill. So raising the testosterone level of UKIP and EDL members is not a good idea, and they are the ones who do tend to watch these matches. But I think the effect is limited. It's not, even if we were to win the World Cup, I don't think it would, the effect of that wouldn't last long enough in either direction. And certainly if it were capitalized on by people who say, look, we won the World Cup, it's an augury, it means that we're going to be a great world beater once we've Brexited and so on. I really don't think that will have that much of an effect.
Thank you very much. Two quick things. Is it worth trying to get Jeremy Corbyn to come off the fence and be more definite, or is it too uncertain a thing? And what can turn the opprobrium of the Electoral Commission into actually declaring the election invalid? Does it have to go through a court? And can somebody take it through a court?
Yes, very briefly, the Electoral Commission doesn't have the power to do so. It's doing its best at the moment to indicate that it really ought to be declared void, but it's a very toothless organisation at the moment, and that's another thing that needs to be reformed.
And can it be taken to a court?
Well, I think there are lots of court cases that could come out of the fraud, the foreign interference and the illegality, and they have begun. So that there are two legal actions on this now. One of them is a criminal charge, and the other one is a challenge led by my friend Jolyon Maugham on the overspending.
And Corbyn?
On the question of Corbyn, there are two probabilities, not possibilities here, alternative probabilities. One is that the majority of members of the Labour Party, by a very big margin, are pro-Remain. And they are trying to get the Corbyn office to change its mind. They're working very hard on that. And in fact, they have, I think, been successful in bringing forward a resolution at the party conference at the end of the summer. But it happens that the Labour Party is already committed by a previous conference decision to vote against a Brexit which doesn't meet the Keir Starmer red line. So actually, this would just be a reinforcement of it. I'm reasonably confident, all the more so because the youth wing of Momentum, which is the sort of left part of the Labour Party, are for Remain. And they have started to campaign and to work hard to try and change Jeremy Corbyn's mind. He is isolated in the Labour movement and in the Labour Party. And how long he can hold out. I mean, he took himself off to Jordan, quite appropriately, to a refugee camp, if you think about it, on the day of their great march in London on Saturday. He was a refugee himself for a weekend from that. And I think that probably his mind could be changed. The other probability is that if it isn't, there is going to be a rift in the Labour Party similar to the one in the Conservative Party.
Okay, this is the last question, I'm afraid.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can.
Does there have to be the decision taken by a referendum? And if so, what would be on the ballot paper? What question would be on the ballot paper the second time? Yeah.
There doesn't have to be, because Parliament could do this. As I said earlier, with a one-vote majority in the House of Commons, Brexit could be stopped tomorrow morning before we'd finished our breakfast. So it doesn't have to be another referendum. If there is another referendum, then the alternatives have to be, and this might be a matter that we have to campaign on, because of course the tricksy types will want to say, oh, do we have, it's between two Brexit deals. No, thank you. We want it between some alleged Brexit deal. That's to say, the one that will be cobbled together in a very big hurry when finally the Conservative Party has stopped fighting with itself about what that Brexit deal should be. So it should be between that one and the one which over the last 40 years, to the great advantage of the United Kingdom, we have forged with our European partners. So between Remain and some form of leave.
Folks, as Peter's just said, unfortunately that's the last question because Professor Grayling has to get back on his train down to London.
But can I first of all just say thank you to Peter for asking me. I'm Jonathan Baker, I'm the chair of the neighbouring Stratford for Europe, and it's a great honour to be asked to do the vote of thanks. Thank you for that. I'm sure we'll all agree that Professor Grayling's given a really thorough analysis of the current situation, both politically and in the world of Brexit. And I'm sure, like me, you're going to leave a lot happier today than you did when you arrived. Certainly I felt a lot happier after the big march on Saturday. And I feel we're actually at a real turning point, and thank you very much for making that really clear, that things are changing, things are going our way, it feels like we are beginning to win. You may not know, but actually Professor Grayling launched Stratford for Europe 2 years ago, straight after the referendum, and you inspired us then, and I think would agree that you've inspired us now to go back to our constituencies and actually fight for the cause. And as I say, the fight does go on. I hope you will sign up to the Warwick District, the supporters sheet, even if it's just a case of donating a few pennies in the coffers to help us fund events like this. And if I may finish, just a quick plug. In Stratford, we have the film from the 48% coming is being shown in July at the Stratford Picture House. Details are on our website or on the Stratford Picture House. So do come on and see that film. There is a trailer on our website which will give you a good idea of what the film's like. So can I just end by asking you to put your hands together again for Professor Grayling and for